In the last week alone, over 1,000 people have crossed the channel from France in illegal crossings in small boats. To give you some idea of how many people that is, 1,000 people would fill a small auditorium. Despite all of the government efforts and what they tell you that they are taking great steps to prevent this from happening, it continues to happen. And a lot of what they say, often via media outlets and social media, just doesn't really add up, some of which I'll cover in this video. What does add up, quite literally, is the numbers of people that do arrive in the UK in these small boats. In the last 3 days alone, over 800 people, with on one day, the day before yesterday, 11 boats crossed and arrived in the UK, which doesn't really seem to make sense. So if you'd like it to make sense, and I'll go through and challenge some of what the government says, I am completely independent. If you like that approach, please do subscribe to the channel. I depend on you to do that, and I have no other media company backing me to do that. So thank you very much. So let's take a look at this, shall we? So when I say these things don't add up, there's actually what on the face of it looks like a very good publicity piece by the government, by the Home Office, published here, and they post it and say, borders are being breached by criminal gangs worldwide. It's not just a UK thing, it's happening everywhere. Life-threatening channel crossings have occurred for years, it's time to act. Border Security Command is how we fight back. I'll come back to that in a minute, because I have some questions about that as well. And this video here, it's a lengthy video, 5 and almost 6 minutes long, telling you what they're doing and how they're working, and a lot of it is very interesting. I encourage you to watch it because there's obviously a lot more to that than simply looking at the numbers of boats that ultimately arrive in the UK. There is a lot more that goes behind the scenes, and credit due to all the people involved. I respect them for doing that. There is a lot of work involved, and they've had some great successes. Watch the video to find out more. The little bits that don't really add up, however, at the very beginning of this, and it's no criticism of the ladies saying it, it's just, it doesn't make sense. And I like things to make sense, and as a lawyer, they usually do make sense. But this seems a bit odd to me, and I'll explain why. I'll mute myself. Have a listen to this.
The organised crime groups are preying on those people, and they're putting them in ribs that I consider are unsafe.
He didn't want to come in that particular boat. He said the smuggler forced him to get in the boat. He actually used a gun, hit him in his back, in his head.
The criminal gang.
And so, quite clearly, she says that. I'm not disputing what she says and what she's been told. I am sort of quite querying how it actually adds up. So she had this chap tell her, it would seem, that he was forced onto this boat in France because he didn't want to come in that boat because it was too small. Now, there's obviously a lot of information, misinformation, disinformation flowing around. They are obviously sold a story as to why they should come here. Lots of reasons they should come here. I mean, many people argue it is purely economic migration. Many people argue that it is for humanitarian reasons. And I think the truth lies somewhere in between. I think there is a mix of both. And it's almost impossible to know which. And once they are here, it's a very serious difficulty to tell the difference. And ultimately then to return those that are purely here for economic reasons and should not be granted asylum. That aside, I'm not disputing the politics of that. This bit doesn't really make sense. Now, if these boats are leaving France, they are physically leaving France's shores, and then they're arriving in the UK. For those questioning why don't we just physically stop them and turn them back, etc., that is a bit of a legal ambiguity, in that we have a duty in the UK that those are in international waters, that we take reasonable care of them to make sure they don't come to harm, because they're in our waters. The point at which they cross into our waters from France waters is a bit more contentious, obviously because of the relationship with France, and it's either France prevent them from crossing into our waters, which they don't seem to be doing, evidently, or they prevent them from leaving the shores in the first place. And that, to me, let me know what you think in the comments, that to me would seem the most sensible way of stopping these boats, stopping them from leaving France in the first place. Whether that's with French personnel or British personnel going to France and physically stopping them from leaving the shores. That seems to me to be the most obvious way of doing it. Maybe I'm looking at this a little bit too simplistically, but that's what makes sense to me. Now, at the beginning of that video, she had a chap saying that he didn't want to go in that boat, and the guy had a gun, hit him in the back, and forced him onto the boat. But if we break this down logically for a moment, if the chap who is getting into the boat to come to the UK has paid, and we've heard the figure of £5,000 a head floated around somewhere, but even if it's not £5,000, but it will be, if the guy's getting in a boat to come here, it's obviously a reasonable chunk of money to pay these smugglers to come here. whatever money is paid him, if he doesn't want to get in the boat, why would the smuggler then force him into the boat? If the smuggler presumably has been paid by that point, it doesn't seem to me that there's a cashier on the shore of France when they get into the boat. Why would he force him into the boat if he's already been paid? I don't buy that these people are paying for this ride on the boat on the shore, in which case he wouldn't pay if he didn't want to go into the boat unless he was mugged of the money. And this all doesn't make sense to me. Maybe because I'm not physically there and I don't see physically what's going on, that I don't understand it. But there's a bigger problem than that, because when these migrants get here, I mean, many of them deserve and need the support, and I'm not saying that they don't, etc. However, there are lots of stories that you will hear, stories that do add up, because I check, when they sound like outlandish and ridiculous headlines, and many people might just think that is a far-right headline, it's designed to make you outraged, and it's completely ridiculous. But it's not really ridiculous, and I'll give you an example. This example here with GB News, and I'll come back to GB News in the second half of the video because there's a major win for GB News and free speech. More about that a little bit later. Do stick around for that. So this headline here, Nigerian robber spared deportation because he would be considered possessed in his home country. Is that absolutely ridiculous, or is there any truth to it? I will explain. Don't go away. Just pausing for a moment, I take a lot of time and effort to bring you news, keep you updated, help you to understand law, and keep you safe from scams on my channels. And for that reason, I've partnered with some companies that help to protect you from scams and online phishing expeditions and people trying to attack you and hack into your systems. And that is why I am supported on my channels by NordVPN, which is not just a virtual private network which gives you a virtual location and hides and protects your online activity, and they keep no logs of anything, by the way, but it also comes along with threat protection, which will scan websites and software that you might download, or files that you might download, just to make sure that they don't have malicious scripts in them. It has a mesh net which gives you secure connections between your own devices so you can securely and safely share files with your own machines, a dark web monitor which takes your email address and then scours the dark web, that is sort of the bad side of the internet that might have your private information, and alert you to that. And of course, you can change your location and you get a dedicated IP address. All of these things keep you safe online, and you can install it on all of your devices. And I've used it for many years now. I initially paid for it with my own money, and I've been supported by them after that since I've been using NordVPN. And of course, as a partner to my channel, you get a discount which is 4 months on top of any discounts that they already do, along with their 30-day money-back guarantee, using the code BBB, which is the nickname you guys gave me, which I will put in the description below. Use the link and the discount code at the checkout, BBB, to get your 4 months extra free on top of any discounts that they already offer. It is a fantastic peace of mind for less than the price of a cup of coffee, knowing that all your devices, your laptops, your iPhones, your iPads, everything, or your other tablets are all safe when you're browsing the internet. Especially if you travel around and you're in coffee shops, this is an absolute no-brainer. So check out NordVPN in the link in the description below, and I thank them for sponsoring this video. So back to the headline. Now, I like to look at these headlines because they do make people angry, because if we look at this in the round and objectively, if you are let's say you're a patriotic citizen of the UK, that doesn't make you far right, by the way, to be patriotic and love and support your country. That is patriotism. That is not far right, and nor should it be confused as such. But if you are patriotic in the UK and you see headlines like this, a Nigerian robber spared deportation. Now, there's an inference within the headline that the deportation is there because he's losing his citizenship, and therefore there's an order for deportation, which it turns out is true. But he's spared deportation because he would be considered possessed in his home country and therefore possibly come to some harm. Now, there's a teensy bit of spin on the headline, but it does ultimately amount to the truth. Now, credit to GB News. They've gone through the details in here. I'll link the article below. But when I comment on these articles, and if I make comment on these things, I don't just read out the headlines, as some uncharitable chap in the comments once said. I just read out the headlines. I actually do a lot of reading and research, and this is the tribunal case here. Now, you can see from the scroll, you can't see the scroll bar. If I move it across, you can see the scroll bar. You can see how long this case is. And if I scroll up and down, you can see how long this case is. This is a very detailed case, which I read and considered. The chap cannot be named for legal reasons, but in short, A deportation order was made in April 2014. This chap arrived in the UK in 2002 as a child and subsequently held exceptional leave to remain until 2006. But then it got a little bit difficult for him because in 2011 he was convicted of armed robbery and possession of an imitation firearm and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment, which resulted in him losing his citizenship, I presume, resulting in the deportation order in 2014. He then appealed that to the first tier tribunal and then was considered ARE, which is appeal rights exhausted. So he's exhausted all of his rights of appeal. So then you might think, well, why is this back in the tribunal for appeal and why is this now ruled that he can stay? Because ultimately, long story short, I won't bore you with all the details, but the long story short is it set aside the decision to deport him and he was allowed to stay. The reason it went back for appeal is because he brought in new grounds, new arguments, and that is the case when tribunals will look at this again. And the arguments that he made here was the deterioration of his mental health. He provided medical evidence to say that he had a significant decline in his mental health, even though that wasn't really argued in his original cases, these criminal cases. He was recalled to prison on license and so on, so there's a lot going on there. But nonetheless, in this new tribunal, he argued deterioration of mental health. He provided medical evidence. It was said that he could hear voices all the time. He said that he was at risk of inhuman and degrading treatment if he went back to his home country because of his severe mental health conditions. And so he faced that risk if he returned to Nigeria. Naturally, then, there were two other grounds of appeal, one of which the Article 3 right of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right against torture and inhumane and degrading treatment. And secondly, Article 8, which is a disproportionate interference with his right to a private and family life. And so because he'd established a significant private life in the UK and his deportation would disrupt this ongoing medical treatment and rehabilitation efforts, all those combined, the decision was set aside and he was allowed to stay. So again, this is just one particular case where this can lead to significant problems. Now, with 1,000 people arriving in the UK in the last week alone, to give you some idea of how many people that is, 1,000 people would fill a small auditorium, for example. 1,000 people if you went to a banquet dinner, and if you were seated 10 people to a table, so 5 on either side of the table, you would need 100 tables in this banquet hall to fill 1,000 people. I mean, obviously, the numbers are obvious, but when you visualize that, it gives you an idea of how many people there are. If you're into football, think of a football pitch. 1,000 people would fill the entire football pitch if you stood just a couple of meters apart, taking up roughly 5 square meters or so each. If you're in a long queue of people standing 1 meter apart, then obviously the numbers tell you that that will be 1 kilometer or over half a mile long this queue would be. And to put it bluntly, as many others have commented, each of those are completely unvetted. We don't know who they are, where they came from, what they're here for, what their criminal history is, or anything. But obviously, once here, they claim asylum. And all of this doesn't really make sense to me, in the sense that how are we supposed to vet these people and then process them safely and deal with them accordingly in the UK? Well, the government has an answer to that. I'm not saying it's going to work, but the government has an answer to that. And that is in their latest statement in response to the small boat crossings. Now, they say they want to end small boat crossings, which threaten lives and undermine our border security. Absolutely true and perfectly fair enough. They say the people smuggling gangs do not care if the vulnerable people they exploit live or die as long as they pay. But that comes back to my previous point. If they don't care if they live or die, then surely they don't care if they don't get on the boat, so long as they've paid. I mean, if you pay for something and then you just don't like the colour, you can't return it for that reason alone, unless you bought it online, of course. Then you can return it within 14 days. Let's say you go to a shop and you buy a sweater, you bring it home and actually you just don't like the colour anymore. You have no absolute right to return it to the shop just for that reason, just because you don't like the colour. So if these chaps turn up, and not for a moment saying that this is a legal transaction, obviously I'm not, but if these chaps turn up having paid for the crossing and then turn up and don't like the boat and don't want to get on, why would they force them on the boat? That bit to me doesn't really make sense. But suffice to say, the government says that they don't care whether they live or die as long as they pay. The government says, we will stop at nothing to dismantle the business model and bring them to justice, which if you watch the previous video by the government, actually, to be fair and balanced about all this, it's a very good video. They go into a lot of detail, things that I didn't know. I learned something about how they are working internationally with different agencies, cross borders, finding where the boats are being made and all of this sort of stuff, and they are seizing those and bringing those criminals to justice. So I herald the success where it exists. But a lot of it still doesn't make sense. But to give you an idea of background behind the video and what they are doing is investing heavily in new technologies, delivering this data exploitation improvements to technologies, 300 staff on the Border Security Command, 100 specialist investigators, a new specialist investigation intelligence team, and obviously boosting the CPS ability to deliver charging decisions by funding them, etc. And so they say that they are putting a lot of money into all of these different ways of working behind the scenes, dismantling the gangs, and working to bring the criminals, smugglers to justice and preventing the crossings from happening. But I still come back to the most simple point of all, and that is, can they not just physically stop them from leaving France in the first place? Surely a few hundred or so staff posted along the coasts of France requires cooperation of France, of course, but would that not be the better way of doing it? Just physically prevent them from leaving the shores and arrest them and detain them there and then? And I may be oversimplifying this, but that seems like the simplest solution to me. And if all that fails and they get on the waters and they end up in the waters, surely taking them back to France and say to France, well, they left France, it all failed, all the efforts failed, we'll bring them back. Obviously, they came from France. Obviously, we should be able to bring them back. Again, simplistic and perhaps superficial explanation there, but that is certainly something that I think would work. But now very briefly on GB News and its massive success against Ofcom, which is the communications regulator for the UK. Very broadly speaking, you understand, news companies providing news programs must present them with due impartiality, so they can't be biased. And if they have a member of parliament presenting them, that can only really happen if they've got exceptional editorial control above it to ensure that it's not a political broadcast. And so there's a lot more to it than that. This is a very detailed judgment. You can find it, and I'll try to link it in the description below. But very broadly, what happened here is that Ofcom ruled that GB News had breached its broadcasting code with Jacob Rees-Mogg acting as a newsreader in 2 episodes of State of the Nation. They said that it violated Rule 5.3, and they also said that it breached Rule 5.1, which in itself was a bit of a problem according to the court here. 5.3 very broadly prohibits politicians from acting as newsreaders, interviewers or reporters in news programs unless there's exceptional editorial control, which is what I said before, or justification. They said in respect of Rule 5.1, presenting news in this way lacked due impartiality. Obviously, GB News challenged this and said that State of the Nation is a current affairs programme, not a news programme, and that Rule 5.3 relates only to news programmes. They also said that their interpretation was unlawful because it was not reasonably foreseeable or prescribed in law, which ultimately meant that this would violate the Article 10 right to the freedom of expression. They also argued about the procedural process and said that their investigation itself was flawed. And very broadly, that was because they started at one area and then they broadened out this investigation when they shouldn't have done. And the High Court then ruled completely in favour of GB News, quashing the decision, remitting it back to Ofcom. But I suspect they probably won't do anything else because, among other things, the High Court awarded GB News its full costs. The High Court, in short, ruled that the State of the Nation was a current affairs programme, not a news programme. Rule 5.3 applies only to news programmes, so Ofcom's interpretation of its own rules was incorrect. The High Court also ruled that due impartiality of Rule 5.1 is context dependent and the politicians are not automatically impartial, and it must be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So even if they had a politician presenting some part of news in some part of programme or something else, that does not automatically mean it was impartial, and they must have judged it so. The judge also rejected Ofcom's broader interpretation. It's a little bit like them saying, well, our rules were meant to mean this, and so it should have been okay that that's what we meant. But the judge, in fact, said that ruling that any change in this code must follow formal procedures, formal consultation, and it can't just be enforced through an individual decision. And so overall, this judgment has very comprehensively set out the framework for Article 10, the freedom of expression, how it applies to news broadcasts, and so on, because this is the first time really that Ofcom has lost one of its decisions against a news company, and I commend GB News for standing up for the right to free speech, freedom of expression, and winning this judgment. This obviously then strengthens the Article 10 rights to the freedom of expression, particularly in broadcasting. It highlights the distinction between what is current affairs and discussion and debate and a pure news programme, which obviously comes under the regulations, and it also forces Ofcom to look back through its code and think again. So I hope you found that interesting. If you want a more detailed breakdown of that, it's a very complex judgment, but if you want a detailed breakdown of it, do let me know in the comments below, and it will take some time, but I will do that as well if you'd like that. But in the meantime, do let me know any comments that you've got about anything I've said, questions and comments, etc. Please do remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And as always, thank you for watching.